and welcome. So in this video, we're going to talk about how to do color swaps in Blender by leveraging the shader nodes. So in previous videos, I've been working on these Crodlu, and you may recognize him from before. This video assumes that you have been working with a model. It assumes that you have your high poly and low poly sorted out, and that you have got the basic shader set up for previewing what you're doing so that you basically have something, maybe not this organized. I did a separate video on organizing your nodes in which I kind of outlined how you do this, but this video assumes that you have your normal map, a fake PBR MAR if you were choosing to use one, and your base color if you've gotten started on one. If you haven't, that's okay. We can use a placeholder image for that. This video does not assume that you have done seam painting, though seam painting will certainly help, right? So let's start with the simplest sort of way to do a color swap, and that's saying I have an area, I have a fully painted mini, and I just want to swap out the color in one section and maybe have some different textures we can use there. So conceptually, this is pretty straightforward. It's just like having two sheets of paper, one fits over the other, and we move on, and this is done through masking. So rather than paint directly on an image, we sort of treat the section like a stencil, paint on that, and then place it over the bottom image. And by this, we create layers using the nodes. So to give an example of that, we're going to start with something very simple. We're going to start by adding a new image texture. And we're going to call this one, let's say we want to change out the barding color. Barding color. We'll actually call it the mask, because that's what it's going to be, barding mask. And I'm going to make this sort of, what I'm using is our default, which is the 2048 by 2048. I want to make sure that color is transparent as my baseline, and hit OK. So that's OK. So with our new sort of image texture, which we're calling our mask selected, we want to connect it so that it layers with our color. Otherwise, we won't be able to preview it as we're working. So we're going to do this by adding a mix node. So add and mix. Add and mix. Now, you'll realize that maybe you're like, wait, that's not a color mix node. Well, it's not. Mix nodes can be floats, vectors, or color, and your options will change depending on what you pick. So we'll pick this as a color node, and we'll let this be a straight mix. We'll talk more about the blending modes next, but we're going to start very simple. So if we want this to be layered on to our base color, I'm just going to plug the color into color. Oh, sorry. Color goes into A, color goes into B, and the alpha of our mask here, the barding mask, will act as the factor for our mix. And this is so that anything that's transparent here doesn't affect our image. So basically, if we write on it, it goes here. If we don't, it doesn't. That seems fairly simple and straightforward. And like, wait, why do we have to specify that? Well, it's because we can do other things with it. And so it's sort of a multi-use thing. Now we want this to be our new result for our color input. And now we have two layers mixed. So that is the basics of creating a layer that we paint on. Now, I'll say I used this to do my stripes. When I was making this model earlier and doing this image texture, I created a separate layer and painted the stripes on and played with them there. That way, I didn't mess up maybe some of the shading and lighting that I had on my base texture. And we'll talk about that a little bit as we get further. But at its baseline, this is all you have to do to create a color swap. So let's go into the barding mask into texture paint. Now, I have done some work to make sure that I had seams painted on this model. If you don't, that's fine, but we want to make sure we're masking this off appropriately. So I'm going to hit this mask button and go to my mask select, and I'm going to go to my select circle. Now, if you are new to masking, there's a separate video I did specifically on masking and how you can use them. But if you didn't, just follow along as best you can. But with part of your model selected, if you've done seam painting and you hit Control L, you're selecting linked. And that's selecting all the linked vertices and faces on that area. Now I'm hitting Shift Select to select a new section, and then Control L again to make sure I'm getting everything with it. Now, if you did not do any kind of scene painting previously, and you're coming into this going, oops, well, I don't have a model set up with seams, and seam paintings take some time, so it's not expected. Then what you may want to do is just paint them. So if you didn't paint your seams before, you can paint them now. Hold down Shift and just go along the model for the sections that you want to paint or want to be part of your color swap. So if you want, like in my case, I'm having the barding be part of the color swap, I can just Shift and go over it with the circle select, and it's going to select it. Now, I'm not going to do that right now because I did do scene painting so that I wouldn't have to do this every time I wanted to create a new mask. So I will just Control L and grab all my barding. All right, so that's my barding mask, and that grabs all of that. Now, I said this was my barding mask because it's just if I want to maybe swap out this color. So it's going to be a subtle difference. So we'll just kind of focus on maybe this part here. So now that I have that masked, I can go and paint on it. So I might say I want that base color to be darker brown, different from sort of the brighter, more wild red I did. And I'm just going to make it a good, oh, let's get that into mix. And I'm going to be a little more dark than that, like that. And as you can see, I've color swapped out everything I had there, and it's ready to go. And that is a quick color swap. Now, you may be wondering, well, I could just do that on the base image, right? So why did I bother with the mask and creating a new section? Well, it's because now I don't have to worry about touching the rest of my model if I want to do highlights and things. So if I want to go do some multiply highlights, and this is way too big, by doing a little way too strong. And I accidentally grabbed part of my thing there, but I'll fix that in the real one. I can just go and use my masking to do all this. Another reason I want to do this as a color swap as a mask and not as editing onto my original layer is I might want to swap back and forth. I might say, well, I want to do this or just see what it looks like if I were to change out the colors, but I don't necessarily want it to be my final copy and maybe I want to play with it some more. I'm just not sold on it being just that. So now that I've done a little bit of that, just touching up, we've got something I think that looks, it's different. It's not necessarily better or worse than the red, but it's just something different. And that is my baseline color swap. So now, if I want to just change that out, I can go back into my shading and I can always just make another one of these nodes and just swap them in and out with the different colors as I go. But wait, there's more. So this is the basic concept, and I did this very simply because this is what is essentially okay. If I don't want those colors there, then I just have to rewire this, and that becomes my base color, and I can just change them out as much as I want, have different versions of this, redo it, play with it, change it out. But there's a lot more options here. So what I want to do now is show you some different ways you can leverage layers to do color swaps. Once again, this was the most simple way, which is just create a mask, layer it in, and change out the colors. And then you can swap them back and forth. There's another way you can start doing this, and that is by using hue and saturation, which I don't think is the best. It's sort of a cheapy way to do it, but it works. So what I'm going to do now is separate these out, and I'm not doing good node management right now, and that's okay. It's just for a demo. I'm going to add a new node, and I'm going to add a hue and saturation node. Now, you may be familiar with this because everyone does photo editing on their phones now. I'm going to put the color into color and my color output into the color output. So now it is putting my barding mask through my hue saturation. So now I can change the color here. And so this is going to, let me get that a little bit closer in. It's just going to be like you've seen before where I can change the saturation value. And these are kind of light touches. You might find it better to type things in, but I could make it darker, lighter. I can adjust the hue to be different things, and it rotates pretty fast. But if you have bright clothing on somebody and you've got like a dress and you want it to be a green dress, a blue dress, a purple dress, you can affect that here with this node, and that's going to maintain the shadowing that I did, any highlights that I did, and it's going to go from there. And you can adjust the degree at which, the value, things like that. And ultimately, you can really play around with that to get a nice little masked in image that just overlays. Now, obviously, I've got some mistakes, and that's okay for a demo. So there you have it. Now we have a base color that we can swap out more dynamically. So if you have a lot of clothes on some people and you want to test things out or just trade them out or see what they look like if they're duller or brighter, or maybe you weren't happy with the color exactly and just want to experiment, you can do that with a hue saturation value node laced in to the color and the alpha. All right. So what's next? Okay. So that's the basics of just drawing a mask. That's the basics of adding this node. Let's say I have the mask, but I don't know about the color exactly, and I want to make it even more dynamic. So let me remove this node. Actually, instead of removing it, let's leave this as our barding. So I'm going to put this here as our, I'm going to frame these so I don't forget what I've got. Join a new frame. I'm going to rename that to barding frame. And I'm going to make a new image. And I'm going to call this one my beak. So beak mask. It has all the defaults I had before, so that's good. And this beak mask, I need to now lace into all of this. How do I do all that? All right, so basically the result of this, which we're previewing, now becomes what we mix in to the beak mask node. I'm going to make a copy of our mix node just by doing Control-C, Control-V. I'm going to take the result of this and plug it into the A, and take the result of that combination and plug it back into my color input, which is wherever it would fit into your, if you don't have this set up, it would just go into whatever you've got here for your final shader output. And I'm going to take this beak mask and plug it into the B and the factor there. So for now, I'm going to start with that. Now, let me paint my mask real quick. So let's just hop over to Texture Paint. I'm going to put my mask back on, make sure I've got the beak mask selected. Okay. And I am going to just enjoy the fact that I took the time to scene paint. I grabbed something wrong there. Control L, there we go. And I'm going to grab the little bits that are here, because I feel like that should be part of where the beak extends to. All right, so that is going to be where my beak mask is. Now I'm going to fill it with just a plain white, which looks awful. I know, don't worry about that. So let me get that to be just white, because this is really going to act truly as my mask. So this is a little bit of a different method to the method I was just doing. In this case, I'm having it be purely just my mask, even though I've got the color plugged in so I could see what I was doing. And now let's see what else we can do that's fun. So I'm going to unplug the color channel because it's not helpful in this case. The color was just white and we wanted it to just be the mask. But look here. If we don't have anything connected to our B, we have a swatch. This is a color swatch. This allows us to change these colors dynamically. So if we find a color we like, we can be like, oh, let's go for something like that. Now, that is another quick color swap. Now you're thinking, wait a minute, what about the shadows and highlights? Because obviously this looks okay, and in certain cases that would probably be fine. You're working on something that's like a tank or a mechanical thing, that might be just good enough. But for me, I kind of want to give it a little more depth. It looks a little flat there. So then how do we leverage that? Okay, so I'm going to just pause and say we've got the basics down. We know how to layer a base image in. We know we can change the hue and saturation. Now we're going to make it a little more complicated. So if the first part was enough for you, don't worry. You can just like take what you learned and move on, because this video is going to get more complicated as we go. It's not that it's difficult, it just is complicated. I will say this, that if you're deciding to sort of checking out of the video early because it is getting complicated in the layers, and that's fine. You don't necessarily need to know these other things. You'll want to skip ahead to the end. At the end of the video, we are going to show you how to actually export all of this to a single image texture. There's a trick to doing that, and I won't lie, it takes holding your mouth just right, not really. Um, but just know that it's a tricky thing, and if you don't do it right, you'll end up with an image that looks really dark or all black, things like that. So just know I would love to save you the trouble, and I will be explaining how to do it at the end of the video. So back to making it more complicated. We are going to take this and we want to apply a dynamic sort of layers of multiply and things like that to it. So let's say this is our barding layer. This is our base color layer, and this is where they mix. Next layer is sort of here, and this is where it will mix. And we're going to kind of ignore the fact that it's a little, our nodes are having to stretch a little bit. It's healthy. It's a little yoga for them. But this is going to have to go through some passes. So we have the mask. We have sort of a base color, which we may or may not want to keep. But let's say we want to add a shadow layer to it or a multiply layer to it. Now, this could be used on your entire model if you wanted to. And we'll talk a little bit about that because this is one of those topics that could just keep branching. So hopefully I'll try to keep it on point. But let's go ahead and add another image texture. And this one we're going to be, oh, it laced in, but that's okay. We're going to call this one the beak shadows. Okay. And we don't want that to go there. We want this to hang out here. And we're also going to do, you go away. We're going to do another one, and I'm going to call it beak highlights. So going back into image texture, new, and we're calling this one beak highlights. So for each of these, we are going to be applying something to our base beak color. Now, we don't have a base beak color, we're putting it over here, but because we're going to be doing things to the color, we need to introduce it sooner. So let's now add instead an RGB node. RGB. Ooh, we have a color picker. Isn't that nice? We could actually even just take this color picker and plug it here, and it does the same thing. It's just having a node rather than just using it directly. So let's say we have a base color and we want to apply that beak shadows to this. So we're going to add a mix node to do that. Anytime we want to combine, it's going to be a mix node. Because it's a darkening effect, we want to multiply it or darken either way. So we're going to take the beak shadows as our alpha and our color. Actually, I guess we don't really need this guy, but we've got these here. Let's get rid of this guy. So you can use this. It's helpful sometimes. But for now, let's just play with that. And we're going to need another one of these. And this one will be a, let's go for a lighten. And we'll lighten it based off its alpha. And this guy goes here. Oh, sorry. It's alpha, not its alpha as color. So now we have, it's a little, like I said, the nodes get a little stretched. We have our mask, which is independently going to affect this. We have these two colors here, which will be our color for our base beak, our color for our shadows, and our color for our highlights. So I'm going to just say, let's look at just the shadows first. And I'm going to plug my results of that multiply into my B here. So we can see that we have a base beak color of a bright yellow, which I'm going to tone down just a little bit, like that. And the shadows will come in dark with a multiply. So let me go over into Texture Paint, and I'm going to go to my beak shadows, and I'm going to start painting. So there's that. So let's go look what that looks like in our shaders. So we've got our base color and our multiply color. Now, the reason I left these two unplugged is so I could just change out the colors is if I want to lessen, let's zoom in on this, the multiply value, I can make it lighter or darker. I can also subtly affect the tone of the multiply It's very subtle, but it is there by doing a little bit of changes here. And that might be something that you find interesting as you're working. So I might say, let's keep that as a traditional dark and keep it as sort of a brownish because I think that will fit. It's a little chickeny, but that's okay. All right. So now that looks good, and that's a much better color swap than just the mask. Plus, I can change the color to whatever I want without having to go back and repaint the whole thing. So that really opens up the door for color swapping without it being having to repaint it each time. So there is that. So now, what about this lighten node? So I'm going to take the result of this guy. So this will go into the A factor. So I had to check some of my other nodes to be sure. The B factor is the lighten effect. So A is sort of like primary, B is secondary. And then I'm going to plug that into our output. I believe B is primary, C is okay there. Oh, did it backwards. Okay. Plug it there. But now we need our need our base color back. Boop. There we go. All right. So once again, it's a little confusing because everything's in here really tight, but this is our base color held in A as the primary, B is secondary, is the what's getting affected by the multiply. The result of that, which is our base colored beak with a multiply layer, goes into our lighten layer and will be lightened by a degree based off that, and those results will trickle down to here based off our mask, which results will then trickle down and join in with our barding, which is joined with our base color, which is then joined to our main color input. Now, you see how this quickly gets chaotic and why I start grouping and organizing my nodes, because it starts getting chaotic. So let's do a little bit of lightning. Much better. Back into shading. So now, once again, we have, this is our lighten, creating another layer on top, and we can change the color of it. So I might have that be a little darker, a little more subtle, something that's barely noticeable. I could also have it be very extreme and very bright and very noticeable, making more of a tropical bird kind of a look. So you can really just kind of own it and play with it until something sort of fits. Like I think that looks actually looks pretty good. Let me see if I want to take that down just a little bit. But subtle's good, but that makes it look just a little worn, gives a lot of depth, especially over just that flat color. So before I close out and show you guys how to bake your images, I wanted to show you an example of what you can do with this. So in this case, I took the basic concept that I did from the barding mask, and I did it to every major part of the Crotlu. And instead of creating, like I did with the barding mask, if you recall, I did a little bit of sort of painting and shading on it. Rather than do that, I relied on the painting and shading in the original texture. So I took the original color texture image and laced it into the hue saturation value node. That way, it's affecting the colors, but I can tweak those colors independently based off the area that is masked. So that's where this sort of setup comes in. I wanted to show you this because even though it's complicated, it gets a little fun. And now, obviously, not all the results are realistic or work for game, but here we have our Crodlu, and you can see that just as before, I can affect the barding by changing the hue. I made it a little dark there, but hue and saturation on it and sort of have some fun with it there. I can make it ridiculously bright and things. I can do the same for the saddle, and I can adjust it to be very different from maybe my original intention and just sort of play with it and kind of have fun. Same thing for the skin of the Crodlu, where I might be like, well, what if it was not a desert dwelling animal, but something that's almost like a seahorse there or a jungle creature, adjusting the factor for blending between my original image and the um, result there. Same thing with the beak. In this case, I might say, okay, let's go for a full, let's do some other kind of colors. I could, you've seen me play with these before in the video, but it just kind of goes to show you have a lot of options here. and can really sort of play around with what you have with just some simple color swaps. And this is also helpful when I'm not sure what I want, but I want to just play and see. Now, ultimately, I like the Crotaloo as I painted it, so I might say, well, none of this is really useful to me, but it gives you options. And maybe for a creature like this, it's not as helpful. But if you have clothes and dresses and things to swap or stuff like that, it's very helpful. Or if you have a different vision, things like that, you can really take it and just own it and have fun and play. So hopefully this is helpful just to kind of see how all these parts can start to tie together. And in this case, I didn't do a full setup here where I'm swapping out the colors, but just said, okay, let me just adjust the hue and saturation on different parts of my base texture independently. That's just to show you what you can do and what it can look like. So with this as our base, the question is, how do we export it? Because these are all independent images. And do we need to take them all into GIMP and layer them? Well, no. Do we need to do this? Well, no. We're going to be able to export them as a single image by baking them. So to bake the image, it's going to be a similar process to how we made our original normal map. Now, if you remember, we had to bake it in cycles, things like this. So if you haven't baked before, I'll go through all the steps. This is important anytime you're doing a composite color image. So to do this, we're going to create a new image node. Surprise there. Always a new image node over here. It can be anywhere in the space, but I like to put them over on this side of my material output just so I know it's sort of a final thing. So we're going to create this. We're going to name it color swap Crotaloo. And he's got a lot of green on, so I'll call him the green one. Okay. Leave all of these as the default. This step, the steps of actually baking out the colors, are very specific. So I'll probably put these in the comments because this is the one thing that is super specific. You don't want to get it wrong. It gets really funky if you do. So with this image selected, you're going to make sure that you're in your scene, which is under your render properties. It's the second option down here. That your render engine is set to cycles. You want to make sure that your bake type is diffuse. So if it was on normal from before, you're going to change it to diffuse. You are then going to make sure that your influence, if it wasn't expanded, expand it, is set to color only. You do not want any of the lighting, direct or indirect selected. Just select your color as your influence. If you had selected to active for your cage, just uncheck that and make sure this is left alone. Everything else should be normal. So the key things here are you're going to be in cycles because you can't bake unless you are. Under bake, you're going to change the type to diffuse, the influence contribution to be color only and nothing else. And if you still had your cage selected and things like that, make sure you just check off selected to active. You don't want it ticked. And then we can go to bake. Now, that actually isn't the tricky part. The tricky part is saving the image. So once it's done baking, we're going to have to change the color space and save it again. So that way the colors that we preview in our virtual tabletop, Tailweaver, and Tailspire are going to be exactly as we've been previewing them in Blender. The bake may take a minute depending on how complex you've started layering things. In this case, I have a relatively complex situation here, so it might be time to take a break, grab a cup of tea, go play solitaire for a little bit. So we'll see how long this takes. Oh, it's done. I lied. Sometimes it doesn't take that long. But there is my color bake. Now, you notice it looks much darker here than it does here. And that's where this next step comes in. So what we're going to do first is we're going to save the image. Just straight up save it, just plain as day. Don't change anything. Okay. Saved it plain as day without any changes. Now we're going to change the color space to linear ACES-CG. So that's the linear ACGS-CG. And we'll see now that these colors look much more like what we see up here. Now we're going to make sure we go here and we're going to do save as. Don't save it over itself, save it as a new image. And when we save it as, we change the color space back to sRGB. So I'm going to call this one for Tailweaver. Save. All right. And that image that I just put with the for Tailweaver tag at the end will be the image I import into Tailweaver because the color space will be correct. So let's let's review. Tidy your nodes better than I do. It's good practice. So we have played with color swaps in several different ways. We've taken our base color and we have just applied a single barding mask, one where we did actually coloring the mask manually, just as if we were painting our original texture. Another where we took the color that we did and we adjusted it so we could use the same sort of painted area for multiple things. Then we took a more robust approach where we said, okay, we don't know what we want as our base, and we made a mask. And then from that mask, we chose a base color, a color for our shadows, and a lightened sort of highlight color, and combined all of those to make a color swap that we could dynamically affect and change out in terms of the overall beak. And that can be applied obviously to any part, clothes, or whatever. We talked about how to combine those. With these basics, you can now color swap any part of your model. So even though I didn't do a full color swap of this guy, we just sort of played around with a few areas, it's very easy to start layering and swapping and playing around and getting different things that if you just want to change out clothes, a jacket, easy to do on that sort of things, playing around with the creature colors. If you're not really sure, maybe you aren't 100% sure you like the colors you picked, try something different and you'll be able to do that. So I hope this has been helpful. Have fun with it, and there's a lot to learn here and a lot you can do with it. And good luck and have fun.
Ba-da-ba-da-ba-da.